Welcome back for another deep dive. This time,
Yeah.
we're going to journey back to 16th century England, a period of, just massive religious change. And you guys sent in a ton of sources,
Mhm.
articles, overviews, even some glimpses into daily life back then, all about the English Reformation.
Yeah,
And we're going to use all that, right?
absolutely.
To figure out how this period really changed things, not just for like kings and queens,
Right.
but for like everyday people.
Yeah, for everyone. It's a really fascinating time because um it was like the rules of the game completely changed. Like
Yeah.
imagine, waking up one morning and everything's different. Like the whole religious landscape is just completely shifted.
Yeah, like overnight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what it was like for people in 16th century England.
Wow. So before we get to, all the drama with Henry VIII and all that, let's set the scene a bit.
Yep.
So from your expertise, what was it like for the average person living in Catholic England, like before all this went down?
Well, for centuries, like you said, the Catholic Church, that was it. The Pope in Rome called all the shots in church services, all in Latin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you can imagine for a lot of people, religion was more about ritual and tradition than, really understanding what was going
Right,
on.
because if you don't understand the language,
Exactly.
you're not really getting the meaning.
Yeah, like trying to watch a play in a language you don't speak. You might get the broad strokes, but
Right, you miss all the
you
nuance.
miss all the nuance, yeah.
Yeah.
And that created a real gap between, the people in charge, the church hierarchy,
Right.
and the everyday person.
Yeah.
But then along comes this king with with a big personality, let's say.
A big appetite.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, big appetite for power
Yeah.
and maybe marital freedom as well.
Yeah. Henry VIII, the king of six wives, and a real talent for shaking things up. So we always hear about, him wanting that divorce and the Pope saying, nope, not going to happen.
Yeah.
But was there more to it than that? Like, what were the real forces at play that led to this, this huge break from Rome?
I mean, yeah, on the surface, it seems like a personal matter, right? Henry wanted a son. Pope wouldn't annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So he just went and did his own thing.
Took matters into his own hands.
Exactly. But there's always more going on behind the scenes. We can't underestimate, the bigger picture stuff, the political and religious currents that were already kind of swirling around at the time.
What do you mean by that? Like, what kind of stuff?
Well, for one, England and the Pope, they'd always had this kind of tense relationship,
Uh-huh.
always fighting over taxes, papal authority.
Right.
And then you have this new thing happening on mainland Europe, the Protestant Reformation, and some in England. They were paying attention.
Oh, so they were already looking for an alternative.
Some were, yeah. So you could say Henry's desire for a divorce, it was like the spark that ignited, a fire that was already ready to burn.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And the result was, the big one. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England.
He basically created his own church.
Basically, yeah. And it was a real power move, not just against the Pope, but also against, anyone in England who might oppose him.
Wow. I mean, just try to imagine the shockwaves that must have gone through the country. Suddenly, it's the king, not the Pope, who gets to say what goes in religious matters.
Just a huge shift.
That is a huge shift. So to make all of this happen, Henry needed some help, right? Like, who are the key players, the people behind the scenes making this new Church of England a reality?
So you have people like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. He was a scholar who was familiar with all these new Protestant ideas coming out of Europe.
Oh, so he was kind of a reformer at heart?
Yeah, you could say that. And he becomes a real architect of this new church.
Interesting. So it's not just about politics and power, but there are like real changes happening to the religion itself?
Right. Cranmer and others, they start to introduce reforms that would change everything, from the language used in services to the entire structure of the church.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're starting to see this new picture emerge,
Yeah.
this new English church. And
Yeah, and that's just the beginning.
right.
The beginning of a very long and complicated story.
Okay, well, we're just getting started.
We are.
So much more to unpack here.
Absolutely.
So Henry's made this clean break with Rome, appoints himself, the big boss of the church.
Right.
What are, like, some of the first changes people would have noticed in their day-to-day lives?
Mm.
I mean, it must have been pretty weird, right?
It really was. I mean, it's such a profound change for England. And I think for a lot of people, It was unsettling. Just imagine going to church one day and suddenly, you're hearing the service in English.
Oh, wow, instead of Latin.
Yeah, huge shift. And the idea was to try and make faith more accessible.
So it wasn't just about politics and power?
They actually wanted people to, connect with their faith more directly.
Exactly. I mean, we have this one source that mentions a guy named Thomas Bacon,
Okay.
and he was like over the moon about this change. He saw the English Bible as like a gift from God and from the king.
Smart move, Bacon.
Right. He knew who to thank. But it's interesting, he saw it as a tool to empower people to really understand the scriptures.
To read it for themselves.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. I mean, it makes you wonder, was he truly devout or just, playing it smart by praising the king?
It could be a bit of both, couldn't it? But I think it really highlights how big of an impact this had. To have the Bible in your own language, to be able to understand the sermons.
Yeah, to hear it and understand it.
It must have been a powerful thing.
Yeah. It's like suddenly this whole world of knowledge is open to you.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And it wasn't just the words. Think about the visuals in the church. The
Wow.
decorations, the statues. A lot of that got taken down.
Well, reformers saw those as idolatrous. So stained glass windows smashed, murals whitewashed.
Yeah.
It's like they wiped away the visual stories.
Wow. Like the whole world was just stripped bare. And it makes you realize that this wasn't just some abstract debate.
No.
This really changed what people saw and heard.
Yeah, every aspect of religious life was affected. Oh, and we can't forget about the printing press.
Yeah, that was a game changer.
Right, because now you can mass produce Bibles and pamphlets. So Protestant ideas, they're spreading like crazy. It's like the 16th century version of social media.
Wow. Spreading like wildfire. Okay, so we had this new church, new way of worship, new ideas everywhere.
Yeah.
That's a lot to take in. But Henry wasn't done, was he?
He wasn't.
He had his sights set on something else, something that would have a huge impact.
The monasteries.
Yeah. Those were kind of a big deal back then.
They were. They had been a part of England for centuries.
Yeah.
Centers of learning, charity.
Real community hubs.
Yeah. But Henry, he saw them as a source of money and power.
So he just took them.
He did. Dissolve the monasteries, took all their land, all their riches, gave it to the crown.
Wow. I mean, I know some monasteries had become corrupt, but a lot of them did a lot of good. What happened to the people who depended on them?
Well, for a lot of people, it meant hardship. They lost their livelihoods, their homes, and there was a real sense of loss. These monasteries had been a part of their lives for so long.
It's like, first you have all this change in the church itself.
Right.
And then you lose these institutions that are such a big part of community life.
Yeah, it was a double whammy.
Did people just accept this? I mean, were they just okay with all this change?
No, not at all. There was a lot of pushback. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536.
I've heard of that.
A big uprising in the north. People were angry.
About the monasteries.
Yeah, about the monasteries, about all the changes. It's a good reminder that people weren't just going along with everything. They had their own beliefs, and they were willing to fight for them.
Right. They weren't just passive bystanders. So Henry reshapes the religious landscape, but then, he dies, his kids inherit this whole mess. What happens next in this royal, what did you call it?
A roller coaster ride of faith.
Yeah. Well, what happens next in this roller coaster ride?
Well, so Henry's son, Edward VI, he was a devout Protestant.
Oh, wow. So the opposite of his dad in a lot of ways.
In some ways, yeah. He takes the reforms even further. All images are removed from churches, no more traditional rituals, and the Book of Common Prayer, written by Thomas Cranmer, that becomes the standard.
So England is really moving away from Catholicism.
It is. And for a lot of people who are still holding on to the old ways, it must have felt like the world was turned upside down. It's like someone hit rewind.
Exactly. And, not everyone was happy about it.
Not at all. Mary faced a lot of opposition from the Protestants who had, embraced the new faith. And her response was, unfortunately, pretty brutal.
What do you mean? What did she do?
Well, hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake during her reign.
Oh, wow. That's why they called her Bloody Mary.
That's right. It's a really dark chapter, a stark reminder of how dangerous religious intolerance can be.
And how easily it can lead to violence.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these weren't just debates about ideas. People were fighting and dying for what they believed in. So you have Henry's break with Rome, then you have Edward's reforms, Mary's counter-reformation.
Right.
It's hard to imagine how things could ever settle down.
Right.
But then you have Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors.
She had a tough act to follow, that's for sure.
She did, but she managed to bring a kind of stability.
At least for a while.
Yeah, but not without some challenges.
Of course. There's always challenges.
Always.
Okay, so we're talking like decades of religious whiplash, right? Back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. So how did Elizabeth the last Tudor monarch, deal with all this? How did she try to stabilize things?
Well, Elizabeth, she was a smart, a smart politician. She knew she had to find some kind of compromise, something that would, kind of appease both sides.
Keep everyone happy or at least, not too upset.
Exactly, yeah. And that's where the Elizabethan settlement comes in. It was this series of compromises, really, aimed at making both Catholics and Protestants, feel like they had a place in this New England.
So like a religious balancing act?
Basically, yeah.
Did it lean more one way or the other, or was it pretty much right down the middle?
Well, she brought back the Act of Supremacy, the one that said the monarch is the head of the church.
Right, so that's a point for the Protestants.
Right. But then she kept some things from the Catholic tradition, too, like bishops.
Oh, okay. So it's not a complete break from the past.
Exactly. So, yeah, a little something for everyone. But, of course, not everyone was thrilled.
No, I imagine not. Like, who wasn't happy?
Well, for example, the Puritans, they wanted a much stricter form of Protestantism. Like they wanted to get rid of all Catholic influence.
Oh, wow. So they thought Elizabeth didn't go far enough.
Right. They kept pushing for more and more reforms, and they caused a lot of tension within the church.
It's so interesting how even within Protestantism, there were all these different groups, with their own ideas about how things should be. It just shows how complex this whole period really was.
Absolutely. It wasn't just a simple Catholics versus Protestant story. It was much more nuanced than that.
Right. Shades of gray.
Exactly.
Okay. So Elizabeth is trying to keep the peace, trying to keep everyone happy. But, not everyone's going to be happy. How did she handle all this dissent?
Well, Elizabeth, she was definitely a strong ruler, but she was also, practical. She knew that she needed some level of religious tolerance if she wanted to keep the peace.
Right. Like you can't force everyone to believe the same thing.
Exactly. So while she wanted to have a unified church, she wasn't, as harsh as Mary had been.
So she cracked down on people who like directly challenged her rule, but she let people have their own beliefs as long as they weren't, causing trouble.
Pretty much, yeah. And, there were definitely times when people were persecuted for their beliefs. But overall, compared to what came before, Elizabeth's reign was relatively peaceful, at least in terms of religion.
It's amazing to think how much people's lives were affected by all of this, by, the kings and queens, the religious debates, the power struggles within the church.
It really shows how history is shaped not just by the big names, but by, everyday people, by their experiences, their beliefs, their struggles. And I think one thing that's really clear from all these sources is how adaptable people were. I mean, in just a few decades, they had to get used to so many changes in their religious lives. New rituals, new language, a whole new way of understanding their faith.
It's like they had to learn a whole new religion, basically.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just about learning new things. It's also about, developing a certain resilience, a way of dealing with uncertainty.
Right, because everything was constantly changing.
Exactly. And yet they still held on to their faith. They still found meaning in it.
It makes you think about the power of belief, right?
It does. It reminds us that religion is, at its core, a very personal thing. It goes beyond the politics, beyond the debates. It's about how individuals connect with, with something bigger than themselves.
So we've talked a lot about the big players, the monarchs, the reformers, the church leaders.
Yeah.
But it's the stories of everyday people, their strength, their faith, that really make this history come alive.
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying this period so fascinating. It reminds us that history happens everywhere, not just in palaces and battlefields, but in homes, in communities, in the hearts of individuals. It's been a real journey, hasn't it?
It has. We've gone from the drama of the Tudor court to the everyday lives of people trying to make sense of a world that was changing so fast. And I think we've done a pretty good job of, unpacking this complicated but fascinating period.
I think so, too. We've seen how the English Reformation wasn't just one event, but this whole process of change, a long and complicated process, but one that had a huge impact on England, and really on the whole world.
It makes you wonder what people back then would think if they could see the world today.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Would they be surprised by how much has changed? Or by how much has stayed the same? Especially when it comes to faith and, the search for meaning.
That's a great question. And I think it's a good reminder that while the way we practice religion might change over time, the core of it, the need to believe in something to find our place in the world, that never really goes away.
That's a great point.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive. Thanks for, sharing your expertise and helping us explore all this.
It's been my pleasure. And I hope our listeners will keep digging into this period and, discover even more for themselves.
That's what it's all about. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.